The crowd was restless that morning, voices overlapping in the dusty marketplace. Horses stomped their hooves, wagons creaked, and the air smelled of ripe peaches and onions. Somewhere in the middle of it all, a man in a tailored grey suit stepped down from his carriage. His boots were polished, his hat clean, his every gesture calm and practiced. It was Daniel Hale, a man who'd climbed every rung of business faster than anyone thought possible. People in town called him the boy who'd turned to gold. But Daniel's eyes weren't fixed on the money changers or the gleaming storefronts. They froze on a small wooden stall pushed into the corner, half hidden beneath the shade of a canvas sheet. There, with her back slightly bent and her hands roughened by labor, stood Mrs. Margaret Ellis. Her stall was lined with potatoes, onions, tomatoes in baskets so worn the handles were tied with twine. She adjusted her shawl against the morning breeze and offered a faint smile to passers-by. No one noticed her much. No one but Daniel. And in that moment, the noise of the market seemed to dim. Memories struck him harder than a storm. A dim schoolhouse on the edge of the prairie, chalk dust in the air, a gentle voice saying, "Daniel Hale, don't let the world tell you you're less than what you can be." She had defended him when others mocked him for stuttering. She had given him extra paper when he couldn't afford his own. She had taught him that numbers could be bent into opportunity, that words could be a shield if used with courage. And now she stood in the dust, trading vegetables for pennies. Daniel's throat tightened. He didn't step closer right away. He stood frozen, as if time had folded in on itself. One world where he was the boy she lifted up, and another where he was the man who could not bear the sight of her, brought low. "Mr. Hale," a merchant brushed past him, tugging at his sleeve. "Your carriage? Do you need assistance?" Daniel didn't answer. His jaw clenched, his fists pressed to his sides. For all the deals he had signed, for all the speeches he had given, nothing had ever prepared him for this moment. The question rose inside him like fire. What do you do when the person who gave you your wings is found broken at the bottom of the ladder? The answer wasn't clear, not yet, but he knew one thing. He could not walk away, and the story of what he did next would shake not just the market, but the entire city that had once thought Daniel Hale was a man who cared only for profit. Daniel's shadow stretched long across the dusty boards as he finally stepped toward the stall. The chatter of the marketplace seemed to hush with every stride, though he knew it was only his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Mrs. Ellis didn't look up at first. She was counting change into the hands of a young mother with 2 children tugging at her skirts. Her hands shook as she pressed the coins into the woman's palm. Her fingers bore no trace of chalk anymore, only the calluses of endless toil. When the mother walked away, Daniel let the words slip, soft but certain. "Mrs. Ellis," the old teacher startled. She raised her head, her faded blue eyes narrowing against the sunlight. For a heartbeat she didn't recognize him. Then her lips parted, trembling. "Daniel Hale?" He removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "Yes, ma'am." Her mouth quivered, caught between disbelief and a faint smile. "Well, aren't you something now? I read your name in the papers, but I never thought—" Her voice faltered. She reached down, pretending to adjust a basket of onions, hiding her hands as if ashamed of their cracks and soil. Daniel's throat tightened. "You once told me the world would listen if I had the courage to speak." "You gave me that courage," she shook her head quickly. No, you did all that on your own. Don't go laying your success on me." But Daniel knew better. Without her, he'd have been just another boy lost to the fields, maybe swallowed by poverty or crime. A merchant across the way called out mockingly, "Careful there, Mr. Hale. Buy from her, and the rest of us will look too cheap for your taste." Laughter followed, sharp and unkind. Daniel turned, his jaw like stone, but Mrs. Ellis reached and tugged at his sleeve. "Don't," she whispered. They're not cruel, just foolish. He looked back at her stall. Half the vegetables were wilting in the sun. Her coin jar was nearly empty, and he knew deep in his chest that she was holding on by threads. He pulled out his wallet. I'll take everything. Her head snapped up. Daniel, no, I'll take it, he repeated, voice low but firm. He set down more money than the whole stall was worth. She tried to push it back, panic in her eyes. I can't take this from you. It would look wrong. By now a crowd was gathering. Whispers swept the marketplace like wind through grass. The rich man was buying out a poor woman's vegetables. Some smirked, others frowned, but a few looked on in silence, the weight of the moment pressing against their chests. Daniel didn't argue with her. Instead, he picked up a basket of potatoes himself, dirt rubbing against his clean hands, his polished boots dusted with soil. He didn't care. Mrs. Ellis's lips trembled. Why would you do this? Daniel met her eyes. Because you never let me starve for knowledge when I had nothing to give back. Now let me make sure you don't starve either. The murmurs grew louder. Some scoffed. Charity, one man muttered with disdain. Another sneered, trying to buy his reputation. But among them, a young boy stared wide-eyed, watching a wealthy man stoop down for a sack of onions with respect instead of shame. The crowd's judgment hung heavy. Daniel could feel their eyes, their whispers digging at him. This was the price of stepping out of line, of caring for someone the world deemed unworthy. But his decision was made. He lifted the baskets into his carriage himself, ignoring the sting of sweat on his brow. Mrs. Ellis stood frozen, her hands pressed to her shawl, as if she were holding herself together. For Daniel, the deal was sealed, not by the money, not by the food, but by the look in her eyes. Gratitude mixed with humiliation, pride tangled with relief. And as the carriage rolled away, the city buzzed with talk. By sundown, everyone would have heard Daniel Hale, the golden boy of industry, had taken the side of a poor schoolteacher against the opinions of the powerful, and the consequences of that choice were only just beginning. The gossip spread faster than wildfire. By dusk, every corner of the city carried the story. Daniel Hale, the young magnate, had spent his fortune on a poor vegetable seller, his former teacher. Some laughed, calling it pity in disguise. Others whispered that he had gone soft, that he was losing the ruthless edge that had made him wealthy. But the cruelest voices came from behind polished doors and velvet curtains. Men who once called him partner now eyed him as a liability. In a smoky parlour above Main Street, 3 merchants sat stiffly, glasses of whiskey untouched. He's making us look like villains, one spat, slamming his hand against the table. We let that woman rot in the dirt, and now he's carrying her like she's some saint. The people will turn on us, another leaned back, his eyes narrow. Or worse, they'll expect us to open our coffers too. You think I'll let sentiment dictate my purse? Not a chance. The third man's voice was quieter, but heavier with intent. We'll remind him where his bread is buttered. If Daniel Hale wants to play the hero, we'll see how long he can stand once the ground's cut out beneath him. And so the storm began to gather. Daniel, meanwhile, carried the last of the baskets into his own grand kitchen. The irony wasn't lost on him. Crates of onions and potatoes stacked against polished marble counters. Mrs. Ellis stood at the threshold, wringing her shawl, her eyes wide in the glow of lamps. "This isn't right," she whispered. "I don't belong here." Daniel set a crate down with a thud and straightened. "You belong here more than I do. This house exists because of you." Before she could answer, a knock rattled the front door. It was firm, deliberate. Daniel crossed the floor, opened it, and found 2 men in fine coats standing stiff on the porch. "Their eyes didn't bother with pleasantries, Mr. Hale," one said coolly. "Word's gone around. The board is concerned." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew this was coming. "You've got investments tied up with us," the other added. "Large ones." And if you keep throwing your fortune at causes. His glance flicked toward Mrs. Ellis. Well, men like us don't stay partners with men like you. The words hung like a noose. Daniel didn't flinch. Then maybe I've been keeping the wrong partners. Their lips curled, faint smiles without warmth. We'll see if you still talk that way when the banks come calling. With that, they tipped their hats and strode back into the night. The door shut, leaving silence heavy in the hall. Mrs. Ellis's voice trembled. Daniel, you'll ruin yourself. But his mind was already burning with resolve. No, he said quietly. If standing by you ruins me, then I was never worth much to begin with. The threat wasn't just whispers now. It was out in the open, money, reputation, power, all aimed at breaking him down. And Daniel knew it wouldn't stop with words. That night, as the oil lamps flickered low, he heard the crunch of footsteps in his courtyard. Shadowy figures lingered at his gate, muttering, watching. Not thieves, messengers. A warning! The sound of their boots faded, but the message remained. They weren't waiting for the market to decide. They were coming for him soon, and Daniel Hale, for the first time in years, felt the cold edge of fear slide under his ribs. The night weighed heavy on Daniel's house. For hours, the old floorboards groaned under his pacing boots. Mrs. Ellis sat by the hearth, her shawl drawn tight, her face caught in the wavering glow of the fire. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked small, not because of her stature, but because of how the world had pressed her into silence. Daniel stopped, staring into the flames. They'll try to break me, I know it. Contracts will vanish, banks will turn cold, doors will shut. He turned to her, voice low but steady. But I won't let them treat you like nothing. Not after what you gave me. Her lips parted, but no words came. She lifted her hands instead, hands worn and rough, holding them up as if to show him. These, she whispered. These aren't the hands of a woman who deserves to stand in a house like this. Daniel crossed the room, dropped to one knee beside her chair, and took those hands into his own. These are the hands that taught a boy to write his first contract. These are the hands that steadied me when I was shaking in front of the class. You don't see it, but I do. Every success I have traces back to you. Her eyes welled, tears spilling into the lines on her cheeks. She tried to pull away, but he held firm, gently, like a son refusing to let go of his mother. For the first time in years, her voice rose, not the soft, uncertain murmur of a woman beaten down, but the clear tone of the teacher he once knew. They called you poor. They mocked your stutter. They told you you'd never stand in the same room as men of wealth. And I told you different. I told you that your worth wasn't measured in coins or carriages, but in the way you carried yourself when no one believed in you. Daniel's breath caught. It was as though the years had peeled away, and he was once more that boy sitting at a worn desk, hearing those words for the first time. And now, she continued, her voice breaking, you're standing here saying the same thing back to me. That's the gift, Daniel. Not money, not reputation. But this, reminding one another that we're worth more than the world thinks. Silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Daniel bowed his head, his chest tight. Then we'll remind them together. The next morning, they stood side by side at the market. Daniel didn't hide. He carried crates, stacked baskets, spoke her name aloud for all to hear. The whispers rose, but so did something else, a quiet ripple of respect. A mother with 2 children slipped a coin into Mrs. Ellis's hand and said softly, "My boy needs a tutor. If you'd still take on students." Mrs. Ellis froze. For the first time in years, someone was asking for her gift, not her vegetables, but her mind, her heart. Her eyes flicked to Daniel, and he gave the smallest nod. She straightened her shoulders, a spark returning to her face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I would." That simple answer shifted everything. She was no longer just a woman selling wilted produce. She was once again a teacher, a guide, a force of dignity. Daniel watched her speak to the mother, saw the old authority and warmth come back into her posture, her smile. And in that moment he realized no amount of wealth, no threat from men in fine coats could silence the truth of who she was. And if they tried, they'd have to go through him first. But something else stirred in him as he watched her, something he hadn't expected. This wasn't just about repaying a debt. This was about honoring the only person who had ever seen his worth before the world did. And, for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt hope push back against fear. The hall was full of polished boots and pressed suits when Daniel walked in, the very men who had whispered behind his back now staring in open silence. At the head of the table sat the banker who had warned him, "Distance yourself from her or lose everything." Daniel set his papers on the table, his voice carrying without hesitation. "Gentlemen, I came here today not to bargain away my soul, but to remind you what built this town. Men and women like Mrs. Ellis, teachers, laborers, mothers, who gave more than they ever received. If you think I'll sever that bond to sit in your circle, then you never knew me at all." A low murmur spread across the room. Some sneered, others shifted uncomfortably. The banker smirked. "Then you're finished, Harper?" Before Daniel could answer, the heavy doors opened. Mrs. Ellis stepped inside, not with baskets of wilted vegetables, but holding books, her head high. Behind her came children, half a dozen, bright-eyed, clutching slates and chalk. Their mothers followed, women of the town, faces firm with quiet pride. Mrs. Ellis spoke clearly, her voice steady, filling the room. "If this town has no room for teachers, then it has no future. Daniel Harper may lose your contracts, but he will never lose what matters most, our children, our dignity, our hope." The room went still. Men who had scoffed days earlier now stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. Daniel's chest swelled with pride. He stepped to her side, resting his hand lightly on her shoulder. "This is the woman you mocked. This is the woman you thought beneath you. And yet, while you hoard your fortunes, she builds lives." One of the younger men at the table, silent until now, pushed back his chair. "My sons will study under her." Another stood. "And mine." The banker's smirk faltered. Mrs. Ellis's eyes filled, but she didn't falter. She straightened her shawl, nodded once, and turned to Daniel. For the first time, she looked not like a forgotten teacher or a tired vendor, but like the cornerstone of something greater. Outside, the morning bells rang, and the market stirred with new life. Mothers passed the word. Children whispered excitedly. And by the week's end, the old schoolhouse, empty for years, was filled again, its windows bright, its walls echoing with the sound of lessons. Daniel stood at the doorway that first morning, watching her command the room as she once had, his heart heavy and light all at once. He knew the road ahead would still be hard, contracts lost, enemies made, but he also knew he'd gained something greater. Respect could be stolen, wealth could vanish, but the bond between a grateful man and the woman who once believed in him, that was untouchable. As Mrs. Ellis lifted her eyes from her students to meet his across the room, Daniel gave a small bow of his head, the gesture of a boy to his teacher, and smiled. Some debts, he realized, aren't meant to be repaid. They're meant to be carried, like honor, like love, like truth, and together they carried it forward. Years later, long after the whispers of scandal had faded, Daniel walked the same market where he'd once found her with trembling hands and wilted greens. Only now the stalls were bustling, children ran past with books in their arms, and laughter echoed where silence had once pressed heavy. The old schoolhouse had become the heart of the town again, painted bright, its bell ringing each morning. Mrs. Ellis's name was spoken not with pity, but with reverence. the woman who saved our children. Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd, a weathered man now, but still carrying the same steady pride in his chest. He watched as mothers clasped Mrs. Ellis's hands, fathers tipped their hats, and children hugged her skirts before darting inside for lessons. One boy paused at Daniel's side.
"So is it true you gave her back to us?"
Daniel smiled faintly, his eyes never leaving the woman at the center of it all. "No, son, she was never gone. All I did was remind you of her worth," the boy nodded solemnly before running off. Daniel lingered a moment longer, then turned away, content. He didn't need monuments, or contracts, or the approval of men who once sneered at him. His wealth was here, in the books being opened, the futures being built, the teacher who had stood tall when the world tried to shrink her. As he mounted his horse and looked back one last time, Mrs. Ellis caught his gaze. She lifted her hand in a small wave, her smile carrying more gratitude than words could ever hold. And Daniel tipped his hat low, knowing the truth at last. Some stories don't end with riches or power. They end with dignity restored, lives changed, and a bond that time itself could never break. The trail stretched before him, the sun rising over the town he'd helped mend, and with quiet peace, Daniel Harper rode on.